Weird history events can have a big impact on the world as a whole, or sometimes even just a small village or town. They can be caused by unexpected natural phenomenon, or humans doing weird, irrational things. The one thing they have in common is just how unexpected they are. In September of 1859, people in the Northern Hemisphere experienced one of the strangest historical events that has ever been seen. Today, the mystery surrounding this weird event is mostly solved, but at the time it was impossible to explain. On September 1st at about 11:30 p.m., witnesses across the US watched as it appeared the sun was about to rise. In the east, bright light was slowly coming over the horizon until the sky was filled with spectacular purple and red hues. People thought neighboring towns must have been on fire. Some assumed it was already morning and started work before noticing the actual time. The incredible light show dissipated at about 1 a.m. until the night sky returned to normal. Nobody who witnessed the event could immediately explain what was going on. They also couldn't have expected what would happen next. Telecommunication was still in its infancy in 1859. The telegraph was the quickest form of long-distance communication. On September 2nd, workers found the network in a state of disarray. It was impossible to send messages. Machines were at a risk of catching fire or melting, and pylons sparked. There was so much electricity in the air that some electronic devices could be used without a power source. Throughout the morning, communications were disrupted. When it was all over, people were left bewildered. There were a few clues as to what had happened, though. The first was that this wasn't the first time such a strange event had happened. A few days earlier, on August 28th, strange lights in the sky were witnessed. The following day, telegraph lines were disrupted. The first event wasn't as strong or spectacular as the second, but it was easy to conclude the lights and disruption were connected. What caused this was another matter, though. Scientists had figured out it was something to do with electricity in the atmosphere, but couldn't say where it came from. Explanations included a volcanic discharge, but astronomers believed they had a more out-of-this-world explanation. Richard Carrington was one of a number of astronomers observing the sun on a daily basis. He would sketch sunspots that he observed. On September 1st, he noted a bright flash of light coming from one of the sunspots. Something similar had been seen before the August event. At the time, the idea that the sun could have caused this was absurd, but we now know this unexpected explanation was the truth. Carrington had witnessed solar mass ejections, where the sun throws streams of charged particles into space. The particles hitting our magnetosphere caused strange things to happen. The storms themselves are harmless to humans, but if some struck today, it would be a disaster. That's because we rely on electricity for everything, from water management to communications, and it would all be wiped out. Currently, there's no way to stop another Carrington event, and if this weird history repeats itself, it could be catastrophic. Decades before the First World War, Germany and the United States almost came to blows in a weird historical event that almost resembles the Berlin crisis of the 1960s. Rather than tanks facing one another, it was 3 warships at a port in one of the most isolated parts of the world. In the 1880s, both Germany and the United States were growing powers with a lot of potential, but not that much actual colonial power. The problem for both countries at this point was that there wasn't a lot of land that was already under control of the Europeans. Americans did have one important asset, though. It had good ties with the ruling monarch of Samoa. Samoa acted like a pit stop for warships traveling across the Pacific. It was a place for coal-powered ships to refuel. America had developed good commercial ties with the small Pacific nation, but in the 1880s, rebels on the island planned to overthrow the government and install a new king. The US did not see this as being in their interests. The Germans, however, did. They supplied multiple weapons and gave training to the rebels with plans to establish their own commercial links once the new king was crowned. So in 1888, 3 German warships arrived at Samoa's Apia harbor. They were soon joined by 3 warships from the US and 1 from Britain. Britain didn't seem to be on either side of the civil war that had broken out in Samoa, but they were still there to see what happened. What happened was not a lot between the 2 growing powers. While battles between Samoan natives continued, Germany and the United States did not attack one another. Neither were willing to move. Most imagined the standoff ending in one of 2 ways. Either one of the 2 powers would back off, or war would break out between Germany and the United States. What happened instead was completely unexpected. On March 15, 1889, a typhoon hit the islands. Hurricane-force winds were reported. Both the Germans and the Americans scrambled to see out of the storm. The weather had been forecast, but neither side was willing to budge. The British ship managed to get out to open water and wasn't too badly impacted. The same could not be said for the Germans and Americans. All 6 ships were wrecked, and sailors on both sides lost their lives. With all the ships lost and most of the supplies gone, both Germany and America decided to leave Samoa to their own fighting, and instead, the partition of the islands was figured out at a conference, to which Samoa wasn't invited, and the US took control of one island, with Germany taking the other. A weird historical moment that took place in the south of France in the 1500s has been immortalized in books, plays, and films in the centuries since. It's a bizarre missing person story with a strange, unexpected ending. Martin Guerre was a peasant from a relatively well-off family, though he could not read or write. He was described as restless and ill-tempered, and struggled to form a relationship with his wife, and at one point a priest had to exorcise demons from him. He and his wife, Bertrand, managed to have a number of children, but Martin was still incredibly unhappy, especially with his father-in-law, who the couple lived with. In 1548, he made the decision to abandon his old life and join a group of soldiers that traveled around the continent. Bertrand was left to look after the children and their farm herself, unable to remarry unless there was evidence her husband was no longer alive. Bertrand did well for herself. Over the next 8 years, her father and both her in-laws passed away. Martin had never been a major part of public life in the village, and things moved on without him. That was until 1556 when the unexpected happened, and Martin turned up. Martin had turned his life around. He told stories about his life in the army, and about learning to read and write. He had a much better temperament and was welcomed back by many, including Bertrand. He was described as a much better husband to her than he had been, and managed the farm well, turning over a nice profit. Some people had doubts though. This new Martin was very different, but in the 1500s, the only image of Martin that people had was in their memories. After 8 years in the army, it was understandable he might have changed a bit. Things were good for Martin and Bertrand for 2 years, but once again, Bertrand's mother's husband would put a stop to that. Martin's uncle had married Bertrand's mother after her father had passed away. He had also taken control of Martin's inheritance while he was away, and now he wanted it back. The uncle accused Martin of being an imposter, and a trial was set. Martin was described as speaking very calmly. He was able to recall stories from his childhood without fault. Those who accused him of being an imposter would often contradict themselves. It looked a lot like this was just a scheme for the uncle to keep the inheritance money. Then, towards the end of the trial, the real Martin Guerre showed up. The man resembled the old Martin a lot more. He was missing a leg after years of serving in the army, but everyone at the trial recognized him for who he was. The man who had been living with Bertrand for 2 years was Arnaud de Thiel. De Thiel had served in the army alongside Martin. They were often mistaken for one another, and after Martin had told so many stories about his life, de Thiel decided to take it. De Thiel confessed to being an imposter and was punished for adultery and fraud. What the real Martin Guerre did with his life after this point has faded from history. In late August of 1986, those visiting the villages on the shore of Lake Nyos in Cameroon would have made a disturbing discovery. All but a handful of the inhabitants lay lifeless on the floor, most in the exact same spot that they would have typically been in at 9 p.m. on any given day. There were no signs that something horrific had happened, other than the silence around the lake and the dark red color of its waters. On the evening of August 21st, some residents heard a rumbling. It was known that Nyos was a crater lake sitting in the remains of a volcano, but the rumbling didn't last long and wasn't much of a concern. Then a mist began to gather over the lake, slowly spilling over the edge of the crater, then racing down the other side. People quickly lost consciousness. Livestock, animals, and even insects were also affected. Some people would wake back up over the next 36 hours, but hundreds wouldn't. What caused this weird historical event was a mystery that scientists from around the world rushed to Cameroon to solve. A volcanic eruption was the most obvious solution, but there was no sign of that. It was only later that they realized that the answer to this mystery was one that had already been discovered and dismissed. For generations, there had been legends and myths in Cameroon about a dark power of the lakes. There were myths about entire communities being washed away by the lake waters due to a supernatural force. It was said the voices of ghosts could be heard here. The oldest communities near the lake knew to only build on high ground, but the reason why had been lost over the years. For decades, scientists had dismissed this as stories from a time when the volcano itself erupted. Now they thought it might be something else. It wasn't only the locals who had been dismissed, but also a scientist who had recently tried to publish a paper in the journal Nature. He had studied a strange event that took place around Monoun Lake. In August of 1984, 37 people were found on a low stretch of road, some still in the vehicles they had been traveling in. He had studied the incident and found that carbon dioxide had been released from the lake, and a cloud settled over a low-lying road, taking the life of those that traveled through it. At first, it was dismissed as too outlandish for the science journal. It would turn out, though, that the science was correct. The same thing had happened at Lake Nyos. Carbon dioxide released by the cooling of magma had gathered in the water. Due to the high pressure deep beneath the surface, it remained dissolved. But something, possibly a landslide, had mixed with the waters and the carbon dioxide got to a lower pressure, where it was able to erupt throughout the villages. Having solved the mystery, scientists are now working on a way to release the gases safely to stop a repeat of this weird historical event. There are a few scary but true history moments where the fate of the entire world rests on one person's shoulders. During the Cold War, that was the case on more than one occasion. One weird history story that is more overlooked than others is that of Stanislav Petrov. Stanislav was a member of the Soviet Air Defense Forces in the 1970s and early 80s. He had a civilian education and was hired as an IT specialist, but earned the rank of lieutenant colonel. His role was a simple one: to watch computer screens that would give the reading of a warning system the Soviets had set up to detect the launch of nuclear warheads. For years, the screens showed nothing. Tensions had eased a lot since the Cuban Missile Crisis, but new US President Ronald Reagan had been particularly aggressive. The USSR was prepared for a nuclear strike of some kind, and took airspace violations even by civilian aircraft very seriously. Despite this, Stanislav could not have expected what he saw in the early morning hours of September 26, 1983. The computer was telling him that there had been a launch. A nuclear warhead was heading to his country. His instructions were to tell his supervisors immediately so that they could decide how to react. That decision was almost definitely going to be to retaliate. The resulting nuclear war would have taken the lives of millions or even billions of people. The system alerted him to 3 more launches, but it didn't seem right to Stanislav. He decided to wait for further confirmation. Other monitoring satellite readouts said that there was no sign of any attack. In the end, Stanislav reported that there was a system error. It was minutes before the first strike would have hit, but there were no strikes. For decades, this near miss remained a secret. It was discovered that the cause of the error was the system picking up sunlight reflecting from the clouds. After the fall of the USSR, the West learned of Stanislav's decisions. One he believes wouldn't have been made by any of his co-workers, and he received multiple awards and honors. What makes this case so weird, even compared to other near misses, was just how out of the blue a nuclear war would have been. All it would have taken was one man deciding to trust a computer, and things would have been very different. The Rey Man is an unusual and mysterious carving that might give historians and archaeologists an insight into a long-forgotten history from more than 1,000 years ago. For now, experts have been unable to explain what exactly this mysterious figure is supposed to represent. The Rey Man was discovered in 1978. A farmer was plowing his field near the village of Rey in Scotland. During his work, he came across a boulder that was more than 6 feet long. After uncovering the rock, he realized this wasn't just some boulder. Carved into the surface of the flat stone was a man. He was cartoonish in style, with a head too big for his body. He had an elaborate hairstyle, a large jaw and nose and pointed teeth. He carried an axe over his shoulder. Researchers determined the artwork was from the Pictish era and was dated to sometime between 500 and 800 CE. Carvings and artwork from this era are very uncommon, which only makes dating the work even more difficult. Usually, experts will compare newly discovered art pieces to ones we already know from that age to estimate when it was created. With the Rey Man, a window of 300 years is the best that has been done. The Rey Man is from a mysterious period of history that we don't know much about. There haven't been too many archaeological digs in the area, but what has been found indicates that a very high-status person once lived there. Artifacts from various parts of Europe were found, and it's possible this was a trading hub. It's thought the Rey Man might have stood at the doorway to an important building. Determining who the mysterious figure is could give experts more clues, but at the moment, the artifact has baffled experts. It could be a Celtic god, a local leader, or even a representation of a Christian saint. The axe on his shoulder is thought to be a ceremonial axe, but other than that, there aren't many clues that could answer this strange mystery. One of the biggest mysteries that baffles experts comes from a time before history. Over the past few centuries, our understanding of how the world developed beneath our feet has developed rapidly. But there are still some unsolved mysteries about the Earth itself. Possibly the biggest mystery for geologists is the Great Unconformity. When looking at the world before mankind, it's really rocks that tell us the history of the world. But about 1 billion years of that history has disappeared without explanation, and scientists and experts are still trying to figure out why. In general, the crust of the Earth is made up of different layers of rock, with each layer a different age. The oldest rocks are typically found at the bottom, with horizontal layers of younger and younger rocks piled on top. By measuring the amount of helium found in certain crystals in the rock, scientists can determine the rough age of when they were formed, and typically there would be rocks from every age. Unconformities are when layers of rock appear to be missing. Unconformities aren't too unusual around the world. The Earth is a volatile place due to seismic activity, and sometimes that activity will wipe away layers of rock. But these are usually localized events. The Great Unconformity has been seen in rocks around the world. Layers more than 1 billion years apart in age are found together. It's the geological equivalent of tearing thousands of pages out of a history book. The difference isn't exactly the same everywhere, and sometimes the unconformity represents only a few 100 million years, but it can be dated to roughly the same period, between 550 million and 1.7 billion years ago. What happened to cause this unconformity is one of the strangest and biggest mysteries facing scientists who are trying to understand our world. It was shortly after the Great Unconformity that the Cambrian explosion took place, when the variety of life on Earth increased and the two events might be connected. A number of explanations have been suggested, like it being connected to the formation of a supercontinent. Others have been rejected. It was suggested a global ice age might have scraped away the missing layers, but that theory has now been ruled out. Scientists are still working to solve the mystery of what happened, and hope to one day answer the question if it will ever happen again. A strange, mysterious event plunged England into darkness for hours on what should have been a bright, late spring day in 1780. The unexplained event made the sky as dark at noon as it was at midnight, and caused villagers to panic as they believed the end of the world had finally come. It wasn't until that evening that the sky began to lighten. Life returned to normal, or as normal as things could be during the American Revolution. But what caused New England's day of darkness remained a mystery. The strange historical event occurred on May 19, 1780. Even as the sun rose, there was a sense that something unusual was going to happen. The sun was more red-orange than usual, and there was a strange smell in the air. People still went about their daily business, but as it got later in the morning, it became impossible to see without a candle. Many businesses and schools closed, and people flocked to churches. New England was filled with deeply religious communities at the time, and this unexplained phenomenon really did seem like the second coming of Christ to many people. Eventually, the wind changed and the darkness cleared. By this point, night had fallen, but moonlight lit the streets. The following morning, people were relieved to see the sun rise as normal. The dark day was over, and they could only hope it wouldn't happen again. For years after this historical event, the dark day continued to inspire poems and literature. The mystery of what caused such a strange event remained unsolved, though there were a lot of theories. At the time, the only thing that people would have had experiences with that caused such a strange and unusual darkness in the middle of the day would have been solar eclipses. But a solar eclipse would have only lasted a few minutes, and there are no records of an eclipse happening at that time. A volcanic eruption could have also caused such an event, but there's no record of any eruptions around the time of the event either. Scientists today believe that they may have an explanation for this unexplained phenomenon. Looking at tree rings from a forest in Canada, they found evidence of a forest fire around the time of the dark day. The fire didn't completely destroy the trees, and they were able to regrow. It's possible smoke from the fire could have mixed with fog to create a strange event. While this explanation does make sense, the fact that people at the time weren't able to identify the cause still makes this a mysterious event. Out-of-place objects is a term used to describe objects that appear in unusual places, which our current understanding of history says should be impossible. This can range from ancient European coins in the Americas to engineered metal in coal beds millions of years old. Usually, these mysteries can be solved as either fakes or someone accidentally misplacing something modern, but some cases point to a more mysterious historic event. The Tamil bell was discovered in the 1830s by missionary William Colesso in the Maori village in the Northland region of New Zealand. The native people living in the village were using it as a cooking pot, and it was said to have been in possession of their tribe for generations. Apparently, it had been discovered in the roots of a tree that had been blown down by a storm. The missionary recognized the bronze sculpture as the upper half of a bell. The sound bow and clapper had been broken off long ago. What was left was 9 centimeters deep. Colesso exchanged an iron cooking pot for the bell and took it home with him, later donating it to a museum. How the bell wound up in the village remains a mystery. At first, it was dated to sometime in the 15th century, a time when a lot of trading was being done between various Southeast Asian nations, including those on the Indonesian islands. Around the middle of the bell is an inscription in ancient Tamil, which listed someone's name, and experts believe the bell came from a ship, but no one is sure if the name belongs to the ship or the ship's owner. The bell itself appeared to be European in design rather than Southeast Asian. It was speculated that it might have been traded from a Portuguese ship to one from a Tamil kingdom, or that it may have been plundered, but that still doesn't explain how it ended up in New Zealand. New Zealand is incredibly isolated. It wasn't until the 13th century that any humans arrived on the islands. The islands were far away from any trade routes the Southeast Asian traders would have used. It's believed nobody there knew about New Zealand until after Europeans landed on the southern island. But it was possible the Tamil Bell proved otherwise. Some speculated it could have been a sign that Tamil traders had been interacting with the Maori people, or at the very least had sailed to the land before losing the bell. However, it seemed much more likely that a Tamil boat had wrecked at some point, and the ship with the bell attached had gradually drifted to New Zealand, rather than an intentional decision to travel south to unknown lands. Later dating of the bell suggested it may have been from the 17th or 18th centuries. This would mean it hadn't been in the Maori village for very long when Kaleso stumbled upon it. And it's possible there are records of the mysterious event that caused the Tamil Bell to be lost, but those records are yet to be found. Buried deep beneath a stretch of marsh and farmland in eastern England might be the answer to a historical mystery that has been unsolved for centuries. It's believed a huge amount of treasure may have sunk into the ground in an area known as the Wash in East Anglia. What exactly disappeared, and if it's still there, remains a mystery. The mystery of the lost treasure begins in the final days of the reign of King John. The king was facing open rebellion from his barons. A French prince had just invaded in the south, and at the end of 1216, he got word that the King of Scotland was invading from the north. John had been in the process of reclaiming territory in East Anglia when he received the news and turned to head towards Scotland to meet the king. He wanted to get there as quickly as possible and ordered his party to cut across the Wash to save time. The Wash is a tidal estuary. The rivers that feed into it can be a shallow stream at times, but when the tide comes in, it can be incredibly dangerous. The sand turns into quicksand and whirlpools develop. The tide can also come in faster than a horse, so crossing the Wash was a risky move. King John made it across the Wash without issue, but his slow-moving luggage trains did not. According to various reports, the entire train, the animals that pulled it, and even the men themselves were sucked into the ground and lost forever. Other reports suggest the loss wasn't as complete. There wasn't much time to deal with the loss, though. John was deeply ill with dysentery, though some claim the loss of his most valuable possessions added to his sickness. Only a few days after the historic event on the Wash, another historic event took place when the king succumbed to his illness. His 9-year-old son was crowned king, but recovering the items lost in the Wash was not high on anybody's list of priorities. There isn't an exact list of what King John had been traveling with, though he had collected treasures from various parts of his kingdom shortly before the incident. It had been for safekeeping during the Civil War and came from various monasteries, as well as his own personal collection. Most of what has been listed as in John's possession has never been found. Among those is a legendary sword that is said to have been wielded by the Cornish knight Tristan from Arthurian legends. To this day, there have been countless treasure hunters who have traveled to the Wash to try to find this mysterious lost treasure, and answer the unsolved questions of what exactly disappeared into the ground that day. So far, nothing substantial has been found. In 1912, Frank J. Kennard was working at the municipal electric plant in Thomas, Oklahoma, when he unwittingly stumbled upon a historical mystery that still has no explanation. At one point during his shift, Frank came across a piece of coal that was too large to use, and so he fetched a hammer to break it into smaller pieces. But to his surprise, as he hit the lump of coal and split it in half, an iron pot fell out. The pot was described as being cast with iron, the type that would have been used by a tinsmith to hold molten metal before pouring it into a mold. Another employee, Jim Stahl, witnessed the incident as it happened and corroborated Frank's statement. Frank decided to trace the origin of the coal and found that it originated from coal mines in Wilburton, Oklahoma. The coal from that particular mine is known to be over 300 million years old, which makes the pot's discovery all the more mysterious. Since we didn't start using cast iron until the 18th century, it should theoretically not exist. Many theories have emerged since its discovery to try and explain how the pot ended up inside the lump of coal. Some people believe that the pot was left in the mine a long time prior to it being mined. They theorized that moisture in the mine softened the coal, causing it to become caked with coal before it gradually hardened and took on the appearance of one solid chunk of coal. Others believe that it's clear evidence of early humans that walked the earth, and that its discovery, along with other similar finds, proves that our understanding of the origins of the human race needs to be revised. Whatever the case may be, it certainly is a strange discovery that will forever remain a part of weird history, likely never to be solved. The mystery of the Loveland Frog is one of Ohio's lesser known, but it is one that has been retold since the 1950s, and it puzzles cryptozoologists to this day. It started in May of 1955, when a traveling salesman was driving through Loveland, Ohio. He approached a bridge over the Little Miami River, and to his surprise, he saw 3 humanoid, frog-like creatures in the shadows by the side of the road. He stated that they were talking amongst themselves, unaware that he was watching. He described the strange creatures as about 3.5 feet tall, with leathery skin and webbed fingers and toes. Their eyes seemed to bulge out of their sockets, and their mouths opened widely. They also had deep grooves on their heads rather than hair. This is when the creatures spotted the salesman and produced an object that looked like a bar or a wand. He pointed the object at the man and sprayed sparks in his direction, causing him to flee. This was the last sighting of the weird creature until 1972, when a Loveland police officer reported that he was driving at night when an unidentified creature dashed out in front of his car. As the car's lights illuminated it, it looked directly at the officer, revealing its frog-like face. The officer watched as it crawled over a guardrail and disappeared out of sight. 2 weeks later, another officer in the same area said that he saw a similar creature crouching in the road. He produced his weapon and fired at the creature, but the frog creature simply dashed away with a strange smirk on its face. But then the sightings stopped once more, and it seemed the mystery of the Loveland Frog had gone dormant. That is, until August of 2016, when there was yet another sighting in Cincinnati. Sam Jacobs was out and about playing the popular mobile game Pokemon Go near Congregation Beth Adams Synagogue on Loveland Madeira Road. He had just crossed a set of train tracks when he saw a giant frog near the water of Lake Isabella. At first, he didn't know what to make of it, but suddenly the frog stood up on its hind legs and started walking away. He also described the creature as being around 4 feet tall. Sam later stated that he knows his story sounds crazy, but he swears that it's the truth. No further sightings of the bizarre creature have been reported, and for now at least, it remains an unsolved mystery. When one thinks about weird history stories, Iran isn't one of the first areas that spring to mind. But in 1976, a strange event occurred there that still needs to be explained. On the 19th of September, the Iranian Air Force command post at Marabad Airport started receiving phone calls from civilians about strange objects in the sky. They were described as bird-like craft, and at first, the supervisor fielding the calls tried to convince the callers that they were merely seeing the stars in the sky. That is, until he took a look for himself. In the sky, north of the airport, he saw a strange object hovering. The Air Force quickly decided to investigate, and a jet was sent to its location, which appeared to be about 70 miles away. The type of jet that the pilot was flying is capable of reaching massive speeds, but he was unable to catch up with the object. As soon as he flew over the city of Tehran, his instruments and communication devices lost all functionality, and he turned back towards the base. A second fighter jet, manned by 2 soldiers, was sent to intercept the craft, and this time they were able to get a radar lock on the object. As the jet approached it, they saw red, green, orange, and blue lights that flashed so brightly that they couldn't see the main body of the mysterious craft. Once again, the jet's communications went down, and when they attempted to fire a missile at the object, the plane's equipment was shut down, only returning when they had flown some distance away from it. The 2 men reported that they saw a round object flying directly at them at a massive speed, and they tried firing at it again. But just like before, their weapons panel and instruments stopped functioning. Once they were able to communicate again, they were told to return to the base. But as they did so, one of the pilots looked to his left and saw the primary craft, which he described as a diamond-shaped object. In the next moment, it released another bright object that started descending to the ground below. The object slowed its descent and gently landed on the ground, radiating a bright light. The following day, the two soldiers went to the landing area to investigate, but they found nothing other than reports from residents in the area that reported hearing a loud noise and a flash of bright lights during the night. To this day, there's no further explanation, and the incident remains a part of bizarre history. The mysterious disappearance of Connor and Sheila Dwyer is one that still baffles investigators and residents of Cork, Ireland, though there is hope that the case may be solved one day. On the 30th of April, 1991, the well-liked couple had attended a funeral a short distance from their home at the St. Patrick's Church. Catherine Fenton, a local girl, reported greeting them as they entered the church. When Sheila's sister hadn't heard from her in almost 3 weeks, she became concerned and she traveled to their house. She knocked on the door but got no response, and so she decided to contact the guards who forced the door in. Inside the house, they found the couple's reading glasses, bank cards, travel documents, and other personal belongings. Their bed was still neatly made, and there was no sign that a struggle had taken place, or that they had left the house in a hurry. The only items that were missing were their white Toyota Cressida and some items of clothing, presumed to be what they were wearing at the time of their bizarre disappearance. In the kitchen, they found a biscuit can containing over $1,200. So robbery was ruled out as a motive. One of their sons, Connor Jr., reported that he spoke to the couple over the phone on the 17th of March and stated that they seemed happy and nothing seemed odd. No further information on their disappearance was ever found, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Theories have emerged on what may have happened to the couple, including that they may have gone for a drive and Connor lost control of their car, plunging into the Blackwater River. This seems unlikely, however, as Connor was working as a chauffeur at the time and had good driving skills. Another theory is that he had a heart attack or similar medical emergency, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. Others believe that the couple disappeared of their own free will and that they started a new life elsewhere, though there isn't any good reason why they would choose to do this. Police have stated that the mystery may be solved one day, but only if their car is found. When Reverend John Stewart and his family moved into Norfolk, England in 1833, he had no idea that he was stepping into a historical mystery that is still spoken about today. The parsonage is located close to the church where John would be preaching, and adjacent to a graveyard. And soon after the family moved their possessions in, they started experiencing bizarre and inexplicable events. In the first incident, the family started hearing loud bangs and scratching sounds, similar to the sound of scratching claws coming from inside the house's walls. Next, they heard a low moaning sound that John described as very much like the moans of a soldier being whipped, and sometimes like the sound of brass, the rattling of iron, or the clashing of earthenware or glass. When he reported the incidents, locals blamed the haunting on the previous Reverend, William Mantle, who passed away 27 years earlier. They described him as a man who had many vices, stating that he often had to be propped up at funeral services so that he wouldn't fall into the graves. They also reported that the strange noises started in the parsonage soon after he passed away. However, a servant of Williams reported that he had 2 of the bedrooms in his house boarded up after his sister-in-law witnessed something terrifying, suggesting that the hauntings had started before his passing. As time went by, the noises grew to a fever pitch, becoming so loud that one of the family's servants left terrified. The noises seemed to start every morning at around 2 a.m. and continued until sunrise. The noises were now not only coming from the walls, but also the ceiling, often following the beat when an upbeat song was playing and moaning when at sad songs. Every part of the house was examined to find a cause, but the doors and windows were found to be locked tightly. People from the surrounding neighborhoods often stayed there at night, all of whom also heard the eerie noises. John eventually closed the house's doors to outsiders, and to this day, it remains a bizarre, unsolved historical mystery. Ancient Egypt has fascinated archaeologists and historians for hundreds of years. Even some of the most famous aspects of the ancient world are still shrouded in mystery. But every year, new mysteries are uncovered that are just waiting to be solved. One of the most famous and the most mysterious of these aspects are the pyramids, in particular the Great Pyramid of Giza. Most today know the rumor that the pyramids were once the tombs of ancient pharaohs. Secret chambers that have only recently been discovered have led some to believe there might be another, even more secretive purpose to these pyramids, though. But given the importance of the afterlife in ancient Egypt and the significance of the pharaoh, it makes sense that these massive monuments were primarily designed to be the final resting place of the most important people in the land. But not all pyramids are like this, and the Pyramid of Edfu has left researchers with more questions than answers. Tel Edfu is a settlement in Upper Egypt that sits on the west bank of the Nile. The ancient site has been occupied since pre-dynastic times, before ancient Egypt as we know it even existed. For most, the most impressive part of the ancient settlement is the Temple of Horus, which dates back to the Ptolemaic times. But the archaeology here has found much older evidence. Tel Edfu was the capital of the second Upper Egypt nome, making it a very important city. During the First Intermediate period, the settlement flourished and grew under one of the many warlords that ruled in the south. It had the power to be the capital of its own state, which may be one of the reasons why the Edfu South Pyramid was created. The Edfu South Pyramid was discovered in 1894, but for the next 80 years or so, it only periodically appeared on maps of archaeological sites. There was so much to look at and explore in Tel Edfu that this small pile of rocks was overlooked. But it wasn't until 1979 that the first proper study of the pyramid took place. Looking at photos from before 2011, it's easy to see why it was overlooked. Thousands of years of sand and rubble had surrounded the monument, and to most, it looked like a strange mound. However, archaeologists realized that this was a step pyramid. Step pyramids are the oldest pyramids in Egypt. Rather than the smooth sides like the pyramids of Giza, step pyramids had distinctive steps, giving them the name. Each step would be made up of several layers of stone. The oldest of these, the Pyramid of Djoser, was made up of 6 steps and was 205 feet tall. It was obviously nowhere near as grand as the Pyramid of Giza, but this was the first step towards the more famous pyramids, which also earned them the name Proto-Pyramids. The 1979 team mentioned the Edfu South Pyramid in their list of provincial pyramids, but they didn't set about excavating it to find out any of its secrets. That wouldn't take place until 2011. When a team from the University of Chicago finally began excavation work on the pyramid, they discovered something mysterious. Today, the pyramid is less than a third of the height that it once was. It was largely forgotten by the local people, but even then, it was known that there was something significant about this area. There were rumors that a Muslim sheikh had been buried near the pyramid, which encouraged development around the pyramid. For researchers, it was a race against time to find out as much as possible about the ancient site before the modern world took over. They found that the pyramid was built in 3 layers, with blocks of sandstone from a nearby quarry pieced together with clay mortar. It was about 18.5 meters square at its base, and had once been about 13 meters in height. It also had no chambers inside. There had never been anything stored here, and it had never been intended as a tomb of any kind. This alone wasn't too surprising, as the South Edfu Pyramid is not the only pyramid like this. It's actually one of many small, almost identical step pyramids found throughout Upper Egypt. Each one has no chamber, meaning none were used for the typical purposes or for burial. That left Egyptologists and other researchers scratching their heads. The South Edfu Pyramid had some clues as to what it and other pyramids might have been used for. Dating for the pyramid isn't certain, but it's believed to have been built during the reign of Huni, between 2637 and 2613 BC. This was the last pharaoh of the Third Dynasty and was relatively mysterious. Not a lot is known about him or his life. It's hard to even know about his succession, but his name gives a clue as to what kind of ruler he was. It's believed to translate to the Smiter. Researchers believe most, if not all, of these small step pyramids were built during his reign. They were all almost identical in appearance and may have been based upon one built on the island of Elephantine. On Elephantine, there's a fortress built to protect Egypt. The pyramid on the island had a small administrative building attached, which may be a clue as to what the other pyramids were used for. Like Edfu, the other pyramids were all located near important regional cities. Some believe that they were built as a symbol of the pharaoh's power and may have served administrative purposes. All the small pyramids were built in regions far from the political center of ancient Egypt, and it could have been a reminder that they were still connected to the kingdom. At Edfu, researchers found a small structure built along the east face of the pyramid. It was here that most shards of pottery were found. One theory is that the pyramids weren't just for administrative purposes, but may have been a form of temple. At the time, it was believed that pharaoh worship was still relatively common, and this would be the focus of such worship in the region. But the building of these smaller, solid pyramids stopped not long after Huni's reign. It's believed that his son, the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, built at least one of these pyramids, but the practice didn't continue after him. Instead, work began on the larger monuments that are well known today. The pyramids continued to be used for a while after Huni, but for some reason it was eventually abandoned and forgotten. In the 7th century CE, bricks from the pyramid were stolen to be used on other construction projects, destroying a large part of the pyramid. It's possible that the answers surrounding this mysterious pyramid might have been among the stones taken. Today, conservation efforts try to stop modern developments from encroaching any further on this ancient site, and to preserve the mysteries for future generations to try to uncover. The Second Sino-Japanese War is an often overlooked part of the Second World War. The Chinese nationalist and communist parties came together to defend their country against Japanese invasion. It was a devastating fight where millions of people lost their lives, and many more would go through horrifying ordeals. It was in this war that one of the strangest mysteries occurred. The Battle of Nanjing is one of the most famous battles of the war. At the time, Nanjing was the capital of the Republic of China, and understandably, it was a high priority for Japanese forces. It was believed that capturing Nanjing would lead to Chinese surrender. Japan captured Nanjing in a brutal attack, but China didn't surrender, and the war continued. The battle took place in early December of 1937. The disappearance of 3,000 men took place either days before the battle or 2 years later. The disappearance of the Nanjing Battalion is one of the strangest mysteries of the war, and one without a lot of information. The story of the battalion states that it was made up of about 3,000 who had just arrived at the battlefield outside Nanjing on December 9th. They were the rear guard and were arranged in the hills around the city to defend against the Japanese. Their commander was a man named Li Fuxian, who saw that they were all dug into their defensive positions before retiring for the night himself. The following morning, he was awoken by a panicked aide. They had been trying to signal to the new forces but got no response. They likely thought that these new soldiers simply hadn't understood the signals, and someone was sent to check on the situation. What they found was unexplainable. There was nobody in the defensive positions. The small campfires still glowed softly. The artillery sat unused and provisions had been abandoned, but there was no sign of the nearly 3,000 men that should have been waiting for the battle to begin. Everyone from the lowest-ranking soldiers to field officers had vanished. The only people who survived the disappearance were those who were watching the bridge over the Yangtze River. They had seen nothing out of the ordinary and couldn't explain where their fellow soldiers had gone. At the scene of the disappearance, there was no sign of a scuffle, or that the enemy had attacked. Nobody had heard any fighting either. Even the farmers who lived nearby had heard nothing. It was as if 3,000 people had vanished into thin air. If a battle hadn't happened, there were only 2 reasonable explanations for what could have caused the disappearance. The first is that the men had surrendered to the Japanese army. This was unlikely for a number of reasons. The only way to the Japanese front lines would have been over the bridge that was being closely monitored. Even though the soldiers were on the lookout for people coming towards them rather than away, it's likely they would have missed 3,000 people going in either direction. Even if they had managed to slip past, the thought of surrender was not a likely one. The Japanese were known for being particularly cruel to prisoners of war, and they would have had a better chance of surviving if they fought. It's possible that these soldiers didn't know about the reputation of their enemies, but even the Japanese had no records of a mass surrender. The other explanation is mass desertion. This is another explanation that has some problems, as there wasn't much vegetation in the area, and nowhere for 3,000 people to hide. The farmers in the surrounding area may have helped the soldiers to escape. That would make the desertion possible, but still unlikely to succeed. This explanation does explain why we have so little information on the disappearance. No army would want to admit that 3,000 people had deserted. It would be better to say they'd simply vanished rather than to admit that this had happened. Some believe the fact that we don't have much information on this disappearance is a sign that it didn't happen at all. Even the commander, Li Fuxian, is only recorded in the story of the disappearing battalion. This could all be a sign that it was nothing more than a wartime urban legend, or some much smaller disappearance that was exaggerated every time the story was told. But it's also possible that records of this disappearance simply went missing over time. Given the brutality of what happened after the Battle of Nanjing, it's likely that 3,000 soldiers who may have deserted simply weren't seen as a priority. Any record of them could have been easily destroyed in the fighting, either during the war or afterwards, when the civil war between the nationalists and the communists continued. It's not only the lack of information that seems to point to a hoax, though. What information we do have is contradicting. Some sources claim the disappearance happened in 1937, which would place it days after the battle, but others say it was 1939, long after the battle was over. Most seem to think that 1937 was the most likely date, but in that case, other parts of the story don't add up. In the story, the Japanese army was already in Nanjing, and the missing battalion was supposed to be stopping them from escaping. This could simply be an error in the retelling, or indicate that the disappearance took place in 1939. Some believe that the disappearance did happen, and that something else entirely also happened. Explanations such as being transported into a parallel universe, or that soldiers were abducted by aliens have been put forward, but even the most open-minded of people would have to question this. There aren't any records of any mysterious UFOs or lights that could give this explanation any basis. If this disappearance did take place, it's likely that it was a mixture of desertion and exaggeration that led to 3,000 people vanishing. It could also have been meant more as a metaphor for how quickly and completely a huge number of people lost their lives during the battle. More than 200,000 Chinese soldiers were reported as missing in action during the war. Worldwide, millions of civilians and soldiers are listed as missing. Their cases are likely less mysterious than the 3,000 members of the Nanjing Battalion, but no less important. If the story was meant to be a metaphor for people disappearing before they could even fire their weapons, it's possible that it's even more disturbing than if 3,000 people really did vanish into thin air on a calm December night. When it comes to historical mysteries, it can be hard to know where the mysteries end and legends begin. The story of the Sunbendar Caves may well be on the edge of that divide, but there's definitely something mysterious about the caves. Carved into the side of the hills in northern India is a trapezoidal opening. Its straight edges show that it's clearly man-made. Passing through the opening reveals a much larger space inside. The two man-made caves are rectangular, with the side walls forming the two shorter edges of the triangle. Only one is still fully intact, but it's believed that the now partially destroyed cave once had the same vaulted ceiling as the one that's still intact. The walls are polished. This wasn't uncommon for ancient artwork, but was for temples. The polish wasn't as high a standard as other polished caves, but it still indicated that this was somewhere important. Historians are still uncertain when exactly the Sunbendar Caves were created. An inscription at the entrance to one of the caves is written in Gupta characters, which would date to roughly the 4th century CE. The inscription has been translated and described a monk named Vairadeva creating the two caves where Buddhist artwork could be kept. That would date the caves to the 4th century, but some believe the inscription only describes renovations rather than actual creations of the caves. For some, the answer to the age can be found 22 miles away at the Barabar Caves. There, a group of 7 caves are carved into the Barabar and Nagarjuna hills. They're the oldest rock-cut caves in India and date back to sometime between 322 and 185 BC. Despite possibly being separated by 600 years, the Barabar Caves and Sunbendar Caves are very similar in design. The Barabar Caves are also polished but of a higher quality than the Sunbendar Caves. It's possible that the Sunbendar Caves actually came first, or at least originated from roughly the same time period. The Sunbendar Caves were carved out of a softer rock and may have been a prototype of the more famous Barabar Caves. One legend places the creation of the caves even earlier, somewhere around 492 BC. The legend also explains the name. The name supposedly translates to store of gold, which was the reason why the caves were created in the first place. The caves were created during the reign of Bimbisara, a king who ruled the area between 544 and 492 BC. He knew the Buddha before he became enlightened and was an earlier follower. According to the legend, he gave away large amounts of his wealth. The stories differ here slightly though. In some versions of the story, his son became concerned about this and hid away a portion of the gold in the Sunbendar Caves to protect it. In another version of the story, the son overthrew his father, but one of Bimbisara's queens hid the wealth away in the caves. According to the legend, the gold was hidden behind a secret door and sealed by a monk using mystical powers. Only when a special incantation is uttered can the door be opened. Stories of the wealth held in a secret chamber in the cave were passed down for hundreds of years. The Mughal kings tried to find the treasure but had no luck. When the British took over India, they also decided to try to find the secret gold. Interestingly, there is a faint outline of a doorway on one of the walls. It would be hard to make out, and the large black mark above the doorway is much easier to spot. This was created by a cannonball fired by British treasure hunters who wanted to break their way through the secret chamber, but it didn't work. Beside the door is a much more mysterious inscription than the one from the 4th century. The inscription is written in Shankalipi. Shankalipi is currently undeciphered script that has been found across India and even as far away as Java. It's baffled archaeologists and scholars for more than 100 years. It's possible that the script could be a form of Brahmi, but that hasn't helped crack what any of the writing says. The script also has the name Conch script, which is explained by the shape of the letters. While the writing is written in straight lines, the characters themselves spiral and resemble conch shells. Not a lot is known about the writing. It seems to have been relatively widespread, but we don't have enough information to be able to decipher it. It's possible that the script was simply used for writing names or signatures. The sites where we found conch script date between the 4th and 8th centuries CE. And that would mean if the mysterious inscription is Shankalipi, it would likely have been created at the same time that the Gupta inscription was created. Whether it says anything about the door or the secret gold, or is simply a repetition of other inscriptions remains a mystery. Unlocking the secret of the conch script could help unlock the secrets of this mysterious cave, or it could simply be another layer to the mystery. In the 1920s, aviation was still an exciting and novel method of transportation. It was also incredibly dangerous. That attracted countless people who wanted to write their names in the history books. Unfortunately, many would be remembered in history for the wrong reasons. Among those was Paul Redford, who left behind a mystery that remains unsolved almost 100 years later. Redford was born the year before the Wright brothers' first airplane took off. Like many young men at the time, he was fascinated by flight. Paul seemed destined to make a name for himself in aviation. At the age of just 16, he built his own plane out of cardboard and spare parts, which managed to take flight. He excelled at the mechanical and engineering side of things. His passion for flying continued as an adult. Even in this early stage of aviation's development, there was still a lot of work that could be gained by a skilled pilot. The most money came from air shows and daredevil stunts, where pilots would walk on the wings of their planes or perform tricks above amazed onlookers. Some would pull banners behind them, advertising for local businesses. But there were also more mundane jobs that showed that this wasn't just entertainment. At one point, Redford worked with law enforcement to spot illegal distilleries from the air. Redford still pulled some daredevil stunts though. At one point, he got into trouble with law enforcement for flying too close to a train. And when it came to becoming a record breaker, Redford was just as enthusiastic as the countless other aviators flying at the time. In April of 1927, Clarence Chamberlain and Bert Acosta set the American flight duration record. A month later, Charles Lindbergh made history in the first solo non-stop New York to Paris flight. It took 33 hours and Lindbergh fell asleep in the pilot's seat a few times, but he did make it. A crowd of 150,000 people welcomed him, and he became an overnight sensation. He also earned $25,000 for the performance, equivalent to roughly $300,000 in today's money. The flight hadn't only earned fame for Lindbergh. The cities associated with this flight had gained attention too. The town of Brunswick, Georgia, hoped to find similar fame by creating their own aviation hero. They offered $25,000 to Redford to fly from Brunswick to Rio de Janeiro in a solo non-stop flight. Why Rio specifically was chosen isn't certain. Some suggested flying to Caracas in Venezuela. It was still in South America, but was less than half the distance to Rio. But Rio was chosen. It would be breaking Lindbergh's record by over 1,000 miles and would involve flying over both the Atlantic Ocean and the dangerous Amazon rainforest. The plane was christened the Port of Brunswick, just to solidify Brunswick's importance in this mission. It was a brand new Stinson SM-1 Detroiter, specifically fitted with extra fuel tanks for the journey. On August 25th, more than 3,000 people gathered at Sea Island Beach to watch Redford take off. Most were excited about the trip, but not everyone was so optimistic. Eddie Stinson, the man who manufactured the plane, told Redford that the distance was more than a man could stand. Paul's wife, Gertrude, collapsed into sobs after her husband took off, apparently convinced this wasn't a good idea. There were many reasons why the flight to Rio wasn't a good idea. When Lindbergh had flown to Paris, it had been on the limit of how much fuel he had. He had even cut off the edges of his maps and charts just to reduce weight of the plane. Flying more than 1,000 miles extra, Redford would need even more fuel. Fuel tanks were fitted in front of and behind the pilot's seat. That would mean that he could only see forwards through a small periscope, or by looking through the side windows. If fuel had been the only problem, it might have been manageable. But Redford was also flying at the end of August rather than May. It was hurricane season, and there would be no way of knowing if he was approaching a hurricane until just before he hit the natural disaster. He also didn't have a radio and would be relying on maps and a compass to tell him where to go. While Lindbergh's flight seemed like a daring mission to push the limits of technology of the time, Redford intended to break those limits. There are two possible last known sightings of Redford. The first was from the Norwegian ship Christian Krogh, which was fishing off the coast of Trinidad on the morning of August 26th. He dropped a carton with a message asking for the ship to point him in the direction to South America. The ship obliged, and Redford continued on his way. A possible second sighting came later that day when an American engineer spotted a plane over Venezuela. The plane was trailing a thin wisp of black smoke behind it. The engineer identified it as the Port of Brunswick from its tail number. At some point on Redford's second day in the air, something went wrong. He had planned to drop a flare on his second night as he flew over the town of Macapa on Brazil's coast, near the mouth of the Amazon. At that point, he would decide if he could make it to Rio, or if he would turn and land in Pernambuco, one of the other few places in Brazil where a controlled landing was possible. If he dropped a green flare, everything was going according to plan. If he dropped a red flare, then he was going to Pernambuco, but no flares were spotted that night. Officials at Macapa sent the news to Rio, but people were still hopeful that Redford would arrive. It was possible he had forgotten about the flares plan, missed Macapa, or simply had to get rid of the flares altogether. But there was no sign of Redford in the sky that day. When sunset came, most accepted that Redford had crashed somewhere. He would have run out of fuel at that point, and there was no way he would have safely traveled to Rio. Not everybody believes Redford had met a terrible fate, though. Before the flight, he had told loved ones not to worry if they didn't see him for 2 or 3 months. He had brought with him weapons and trinkets so that if he did crash land in the Amazon rainforest, he would be able to trade with the people there. He believed he would be able to walk out of the jungle unharmed. It was still an extremely dangerous proposition. Not much was known about the uncontacted tribes that lived in the jungle, but there were many horror stories about what they did to outsiders. How many of them were truthful and how many of them were just stories is not known. Over the next few years, there were many stories that came out of the jungle about a white man believed to be Redford. Particularly in the mid-1930s, at least 3 different people came forward to tell of a man who had fallen from the sky with 2 broken legs, but was still living with the tribe in the rainforest. In some stories, he was held captive there. Others said he was willingly living in the tribe. At least one person claimed to have seen and spoken with Redford directly. He claimed that the aviator had a native wife and a child in the rainforest, but that person also said he'd gone into the forest with a man named Art Williams, who denied ever meeting the man who told the story. A total of 13 rescue attempts were made, and at least 2 people lost their lives in the Amazon searching for Redford. At this point, rescuing the missing aviator, or even finding any evidence of his fate, would have gained more fame than the flight from Brunswick to Rio, but no sign of the pilot or his plane were ever found. Redford's parents passed away believing their son was still alive in the Amazon somewhere. The truth about what happened to him is still a mystery to this day. Not even his plane has ever been found, despite the technology that we have available, and the recent focus on what's hidden beneath the rainforest's canopy. In 1922, archaeologists stumbled across an extremely strange find in ancient Egypt. Wrapped in luxurious linen and buried in an ancient tomb were heavy black stones of some long-existent creature. These relics were given the name the Black Bones of Set and are almost as mysterious now as they were when they were rediscovered 100 years ago. The findings were made by archaeologists Guy Brunton and Sir Flinders Petrie in the ancient site of Qawa el-Kabir. The town sat on the eastern edge of the Nile and was close to where the desert reached the fertile land. It was an ancient settlement with tombs here dating back to the Old Kingdom, and some evidence of occupation as early as the pre-dynastic era. But the most impressive of these tombs came from around the 12th century. These are the biggest private tombs from the Egyptian Middle Kingdom and were made for governors. Unfortunately, these tombs were looted and destroyed in antiquity, like many ancient Egyptian sites. Still, many relics remained, including sarcophagi of the ancient governors and statues. Brunton and Petrie recorded thousands of tombs and investigated many of the most impressive, and those that had not been looted. Among the artifacts, they found bundles of linen that contained something heavy. When the researchers opened the bundles, what they found was shocking. The remains inside were black and heavy, heavier than any of the remains that had been uncovered so far. They also didn't appear to be human. The archaeologists knew what they were looking at. These were fossils and dated back millions of years. At the time, the researchers believed that they had found something important. A geologist was sent to try to figure out where the fossils had originated. Unfortunately, he could never determine the site. It's likely that the fossils were uncovered during sandstorms, and the ancient Egyptians simply stumbled across them. Whether they took those that had been revealed to them or excavated to see if there was anything else hidden beneath the sand is something we may never know. A total of almost 3 tons of fossils have been collected and carefully preserved in these tombs. The tombs themselves were already 1,500 years old by the time the ancient archaeologists decided that this would be the final resting place of the mysterious fossils. Modern researchers have determined that the fossils were given a burial suitable for a high-ranking official, sometime between 1300 and 1200 BC. What the ancient Egyptians thought the fossils were and why they placed them in these tombs are mysteries that archaeologists can only guess at. Unfortunately, after Brunton and Petrie found the fossils, they were placed in crates and shipped to England, where they remained undisturbed for almost 100 years. Petrie had wanted to write about the fossils but never got around to it. It was only when the fossils were accidentally transferred to the Bolton Museum, along with a large amount of ancient textiles, that researchers finally began to unlock the secrets of these mysterious fossils. The bones came from a variety of animals, including humans, ancient wildebeest, crocodiles, and horses. The most common animal found among them, though, were hippopotamuses. Researchers believe that the place where the fossils were taken may be a clue as to what the ancient Egyptians thought of them. According to scholars, the town was home to a cult dedicated to the god Set. Set is a complicated god. Like many ancient gods, his importance and characterization differed depending on who was in charge. Some dynasties were more sympathetic to the god than others. Generally, he's associated with chaos and darkness. He wasn't necessarily an evil god, and played an important part in protecting Ra and his journey through the underworld at night. But there were also a lot of myths that depicted Set in a less than friendly light. The most famous myth concerning Set is that of his fight with his nephew Horus for the throne of Egypt. Set had already taken the life of his brother Osiris to claim the throne, but now had to better Osiris' son, Horus. The other gods put them through a number of tasks to see who would be the most fit. In the end, it came down to a boat race, but Set determined that the boats must be made of stone. Horus attempted to cheat with a boat made of wood and covered in limestone, while Set took to the top of a mountain. When Set's boat sank, he turned into a hippopotamus and attacked Horus, revealing the trick. Horus would be granted the throne of Egypt anyway, after the gods asked Osiris who he would choose. This was the most prominent connection Set had with the hippopotamus. He was also connected to a variety of other animals. Almost all of them were animals considered by the ancient Egyptians to be dirty or dangerous. Scholars believe that the ancient Egyptians may have believed the fossils were either a relic of Set or the bones of the god himself. The ancient religion taught that the bones of the gods were made from iron, which would have explained both their color and their weight to the ancient Egyptians. With human bones mixed with hippo bones, it's possible that they thought the fossils all came from the same creature. There's one problem with this, and that's that Set isn't typically depicted as a hippo. There are some reliefs depicting the earlier myth where Set appears to be a hippo, but in almost all depictions of Set, he appears with the head of the quote Set animal. The Set animal is another ancient Egyptian mystery, as researchers haven't been able to figure out what animal Set was supposed to be represented by. All the other ancient Egyptian gods have the heads of clearly recognizable animals, but the closest scholars have come to identifying the Set animal is that it may have been some kind of dog or jackal, or a cross between all the dangerous animals the Egyptians knew, but it wasn't a hippo. Set's wife, Taweret, did have the head of a hippopotamus though. Taweret was the goddess of childbirth and was represented by some of the most dangerous animals Egyptians knew. It's possible that rather than the fossils being connected to Set, they were connected to Taweret in ancient times. If the ancient Egyptians did believe that these fossils were the bones of a god, it seems more likely that it was this god. For some reason though, scholars have connected the bones to Set, giving them the name the Black Bones of Set. Another problem with this theory is the lack of writing about it. The ancient Egyptians were very thorough in their writing, and even the possibility that the bones of a god had been uncovered would likely have been written somewhere. But so far, historians have found no record of the bones of Set or any other god being uncovered. There doesn't appear to have been any record of the fossil's discovery or entombment, making the discovery even more mysterious. It seemed like this was something that the Egyptian authorities didn't want the people to know about. Hopefully, now that research has begun on the fossils, we will be able to answer some of the mysteries surrounding the Black Bones of Set. But there's only so much that the fossils themselves can tell us, and the true answers may be in Egyptian records waiting to be uncovered. In 1935, Dutch Schultz lost his life in the bathroom of a New Jersey bar that he owned. He had been directly responsible for the passing of 136 people in a criminal career that lasted less than 10 years. But in the end, his plans had been too much for the other organized crime bosses. As well as leaving behind a dark true crime story, he also inspired a legend about a lost treasure buried away in upstate New York. Schultz was born as Arthur Simon Flagenheimer in August of 1901. He had to drop out of school in the 8th grade to help support his family, and it wasn't long before he turned to crime. This started as petty theft and burglaries, but when the Prohibition began, he started getting involved in more serious crimes. Around the same time, he was given the name Dutch Schultz, and that was the name he would be remembered as for more than 100 years. Making alcohol, smuggling it across the border from Canada, and distributing it at bars and clubs was what earned Schultz his fortune. But it didn't stop there. He also expanded to gambling, including taking over many of the numbers games in places like Harlem. He also dealt with other illegal substances and protection rackets. Of course, none of this came without violence. Schultz was known for being particularly brutal and desensitized to the violence. After Al Capone was locked up for tax evasion, Schultz became public enemy number one. He stood trial for tax evasion twice. The first time it was a hung jury. The second time the case was dismissed due to a lack of evidence. It's believed that jury tampering was the real reason that he wasn't found guilty. Schultz knew that he was a big target for law enforcement though. According to legend, around this time he decided he needed to protect his money from authorities. He had henchmen clear out his safe and any money they could get from his bank account. Then Schultz and his bodyguard, Lulu, traveled to Phoenicia to bury the treasure in a steel-lined box. He then marked an X on a nearby tree and swore Lulu Rosencrantz to secrecy. Rosencrantz told another one of Schultz's followers, a man named Marty Crumpier, and even drew him a map. Before long, rumors of Schultz's buried treasure had spread through Crumpier's criminal networks. But Schultz had bigger problems than that. He had lost a lot of respect from his followers after reducing their payments to pay for his own defense in court. He also felt like he had to do something to secure his position. Lots of people would lose their lives, so Schultz could somehow show everyone that he was still in charge. This worried the New York Crime Syndicate, a group of different organized crime groups that had come together to protect their own interest. This sort of thing would only draw more attention from authorities and risk the authorities coming down hard on all of them. Then Schultz planned to take the life of the DA, Thomas Dewey. Schultz knew he was Dewey's main target. Dewey thought putting Schultz away for good would be good for his political career, and getting rid of Dewey seemed like the logical step. The rest of the syndicate knew that it would be bad for everyone. On October 23, 1935, two members of the syndicate visited Schultz at the bar that he owned in New Jersey. Both Schultz and Rosencrantz were struck by bullets. On the same day, Kramer was attacked in a barber shop. Schultz lived for several hours. Police surrounded him, writing down everything that he said. Most of it was ramblings that didn't make any sense, but some seemed to be clues to where his hidden treasure was located. The clues seemed to point to Phoenicia. He passed away from his wounds before giving an exact location. Rosencrantz also passed away, but Kramer survived. But the map Rosencrantz gave him had been stolen. As far as anybody knows, Schultz's treasure was never found. If the legend is to be believed, paper banknotes, gold coins, and diamonds worth a total of between $5 and $9 million were buried in upstate New York. Today, that money would be worth between $50 and $100 million, and it may still be waiting to be found. The Lady and the Unicorn tapestries have been called the Mona Lisa of the woven world, and may have even more mysteries than the more famous artwork. Like the Mona Lisa, we don't know who the person in the tapestries is, but we also don't know who created the artwork, who commissioned it, or what the art is supposed to mean. It wasn't until 1841 that the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries were discovered in a castle in France. They were badly damaged after years of poor storage and owners who didn't care about the history of the work. One story states that there was one more piece of the collection, but these were cut up to cover carts. One of the 6 existing pieces is much shorter than the rest. It's believed that the bottom of this piece was cut to form a rug for some minor official. But when writer George Sand came across the tapestries, she knew they were something special. She wrote about them in her novel and brought them to the public attention. Finally, the tapestries were rescued and taken to a museum, where work has been done to restore them. Sand dated the artwork to roughly the year 1500, using the dresses of the women in the images as a reference. But there was nothing to say anymore about what the artwork was supposed to represent, and everything else we know about the tapestries has come from the interpretation of art historians. It's believed that 5 of the 6 pieces are meant to represent the common senses. Touch shows the titular lady holding a banner in one hand and touching the horn of a unicorn in the other. On her right is a lion that looks on. Taste has the unicorn and lion on either side of the lady, and her maid, with both animals holding banners. The lady takes food from a container held by her maid and offers one to a bird that she holds in her other hand. On the floor in front of them, a monkey eats a sweetmeat. Smell was harder to distinguish. Again, the unicorn and lion are on either side of the two women, this time also wearing shields. The maid holds a plate of flowers that the lady is weaving together. Behind them, the monkey smells one of the flowers, indicating the meaning of the piece. Hearing is much more obvious, with the lady and her maid playing an instrument while the unicorn and lion hold banners. Finally, in sight, the lady sits with the unicorn beside her. She shows a mirror to the unicorn, and its reflection can be seen. A lion looks away while holding the banner. The final of the 6 tapestries is much more mysterious. It doesn't correspond to any of the basic senses, but historians believe it might represent love, spirituality, or the soul. The lady comes out of a tent, which is being held open by the lion and the unicorn. She seems to be placing a necklace into a chest held by her maid. It's the only image where the lady is smiling. A motto on the tent reads, "My sole desire." Each image features a red background covered in plants and animals. The art style is referred to as 1,000 flowers, which was popular in France around the year 1500. The banners and shields in the tapestry all have the same design: 3 white crescents on a blue background, which runs diagonally over a red background. It was the coat of arms of the Levista family. Not much is known about this family. They weren't nobles, but minor officials. Jean Levista rose through the ranks of the court of King Louis XI, who ruled until 1483 and later served in the court of Charles VIII. He liked to display the family crest as much as possible, and so it would make sense for him to have commissioned the piece. He passed away in the year 1500, but it would have taken many years for the tapestries to be completed. It's possible this was one of the last pieces of art he commissioned. Others believe that the colors of the crest aren't quite right, which could mean it was commissioned by someone in the junior branch of the family. Antoine II has been suggested. As Jean passed away without a male heir, Antoine became the head of the family. He later married a woman named Jacqueline. The letters A and I appear at the top of the tent in the final tapestry, which could refer to the couple. The identity of the owner isn't the only mystery. Like the Mona Lisa, we don't know who exactly the lady is supposed to be. Some believe it to be Mary Tudor, the final wife of King Louis XII, and the sister of Henry VIII. That would put the creation of the tapestry back to after 1514, which could indicate Antoine was behind the tapestry after all. Tapestries have only recently begun to be studied in depth by art historians, so it's possible that one day we will find the answers to some of the mysteries surrounding this famous art. The women Air Force service pilots played an important role during the Second World War and had to fight to be recognized for decades afterwards. 38 women lost their lives in the service, but only one of them vanished without a trace. Today, the search for answers about what happened to Gertrude Tompkins Silver continues. Gertrude was 33 years old when she disappeared in October of 1944. She had fallen in love with flying years earlier while dating a Royal Air Force pilot. He had taken her flying and given her flying lessons. This was a time when female pilots were exceptionally rare, and it was unlikely Gertrude would ever have gotten near a plane if it hadn't been for him. But once in the air and at the controls, Gertrude had a newfound confidence. Her boyfriend passed away during a mission. Gertrude grieved him, but it didn't stop her love for flying. Before this point, Gertrude had been a shy and timid young woman. She was born in New Jersey and had a stutter that her parents did everything to try to help her overcome. Gertrude had studied at the Ambler School of Horticulture and briefly became a goat herder. But it was only after she started flying that her stutter disappeared and she became more confident. The Women Air Force Service Pilots Organization, or WASPs, was formed in 1943 after the merger of 2 civilian services that had only started the year before. They would test aircraft, transport them across the United States, and train other pilots. Only a little over 1,000 women were able to complete the tough training and selection process. Gertrude was one of them. While the other women in the service were mostly younger than Gertrude, her experience may have given her the edge. She was able to fly multiple different types of planes and would spend her free time studying rather than going out dancing with the other women. Even though the Wasps didn't get much respect from their male counterparts, Gertrude loved what she did and seemed happy enough on the afternoon of October 26, 1944, when she took off for the final time. The last mission Gertrude would be a part of was a typical transport mission. She and the other Wasps would fly P-51 planes from the mines field in Los Angeles to New Jersey. It would be a multi-leg journey taking about 4 days, with the first stop scheduled to be Arizona. Once they made it to New Jersey, the planes would be transported by ship to Great Britain. Many of the P-51s had never been flown before, and immediately there were problems. 3 of the planes, including one assigned to Gertrude, had issues with their cockpit doors and would need repairs. They were left behind while the rest of the field headed to Arizona. By the time the repairs were completed, it was too late for Gertrude and the other 2 pilots to make it all the way to Arizona before dark. They would have to stop at Palm Springs. At 3:42 p.m., the 3 planes took off. That evening, only 2 planes landed in Palm Springs. The pilots initially believed Gertrude had more problems with her cockpit door and had turned back. The truth was that Gertrude had flown into a bank of fog and was never seen again. It wouldn't be until October 30th that anybody realized Gertrude was actually missing. After this, the search for her and her plane began. It's believed she may have crashed into Santa Monica Bay or the San Bernardino mountain range. Among the people searching for Gertrude was Henry Silver. He was another member of the Air Force and had actually married Gertrude a month earlier. It was preferred that Wasps were unmarried, so they had kept their marriage a secret. He hadn't been able to see her since the wedding, but they'd already begun planning their lives together. Her disappearance was a complete shock. No sign of Gertrude or her plane was ever found. To this day, we can only speculate about what happened to her. In recent years, there have been a number of search efforts in Santa Monica Bay for Gertrude and her plane. 2 other planes have been located, but none that match the P-51's description. But with lost planes being found every year, it's hopeful that we might soon be able to answer some of the questions about what happened to Gertrude Tompkins Silver. For 4 centuries, the Xiongnu were China's volatile northern neighbors. It was this nomadic group that the Chinese were trying to keep out when they built the earliest stages of the Great Wall. The Chinese government tried diplomacy and war to try to stop the Xiongnu, but it wouldn't be until late in the 1st century CE that they would be defeated. So it was a surprise when archaeologists found the ruins of the Han Dynasty palace deep in the Xiongnu territory. At its height, the Xiongnu territory covered what is today Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Kyrgyzstan, as well as parts of northern China and southern Russia. It was in South Russia that this mysterious palace was discovered. In 1940, a construction project was underway to connect the capital of Khakassia Republic to a village named Askis. Workers dug up tiles and masonry that didn't appear to be recent and contacted experts to see if they could explain what was found. The excavation took place over the next 5 or 6 years, though it had to be paused multiple times during the war. Varvara Levashova was the first one on the scene and knew she was dealing with something impressive. She brought another woman from the State Historical Museum on board. Initially, it was believed that this was the Xiongnu Palace complex. It was far within the Xiongnu territory, though that didn't fit with what was known about the Confederacy. The Xiongnu were nomads. According to one Chinese scholar writing in the time of the Xiongnu, they moved about in search of water and pasture, and had no walled cities or fixed dwellings. They also didn't have any agriculture. There was obviously some bias in this assessment. The Han thought the Xiongnu were barbarians and wild men, but it does fit what we know about the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu may not have had walled cities, but they did have a complex society with a hierarchy of leaders and officials. They were also well trained at fighting from horseback, making them a terrifying enemy when the Han went up against them in war. Whether or not this group had any connection to the later Mongols or Huns is still being debated by scholars, but many of the things these 2 groups were known for could be found in stories about the Xiongnu. So finding any kind of palace that may have been constructed by them was an incredible discovery. The whole building measured 45 meters from north to south and 35 meters from east to west. it was oriented precisely on the cardinal axis. There were 20 rooms in one central hall that measured 12 by 12 meters. It was clear this place had a good level of engineering. The palace had been built on flattened mud, with stone slabs on top to make up the floor. Beneath the slabs, though, were pipes or channels that would have transported hot air to heat the building. Several artifacts were found, including metal door ornaments and pottery, but the biggest find was the roof tiles. Some of the tiles had Chinese letters printed on them. They translated to "Son of Heaven, 10,000 years of peace," and one of which we wish 1,000 autumns of joy without sorrow. Son of Heaven is believed to refer to the Chinese emperor, with the empress being wished 1,000 autumns of joy. After this discovery, it was clear that this was a Chinese palace, rather than a Xiongnu one, but who it belonged to remained a mystery. Unfortunately, the road building program had to go ahead, so the site of the palace was destroyed. Archaeologists tried to save as much as possible, and many artifacts have been saved and now appear in museums. The destruction may have limited our chances of ever getting answers to this strange historical mystery. North Korea is well known for its secretive nature. There are many unsolved mysteries that may have their answers hidden inside the Hermit Kingdom, including the disappearance of foreign nationals and the untimely end of certain politicians. But one of the strangest unsolved mysteries to come from North Korea is what happened in November of 1986. There was very little to suggest anything unusual was going on in North Korea in the lead up to November 16th. The loudspeakers at the demilitarized zone were still playing propaganda, telling everyone how great North Korea and its leader, Kim Il-sung, was. There was a planned meeting between Kim and the General Secretary of Mongolia's ruling party coming up, but it was nothing that would have made headlines around the world. In South Korea, on November 15th, there was a small newspaper story stating that Japanese intelligence believed North Korea's great leader had passed away. He'd been hit by a bullet by members of the North Korean elite who had defected to China. Most ignored the story. It wasn't uncommon for these sorts of rumors to appear. Most people expected they would find news of Kim Il-sung's passing on the front page, not a small report hidden inside the paper. But the rumors didn't end there. At midday the next day, a Sunday, sad music began to play from the North Korean speakers at the DMZ. There were no words or propaganda. It was something nobody had seen before, and extremely confusing for everyone on the South Korean side of the border. Then someone began reading Kim's biography through a megaphone. Then another message came from a speaker more than 100 kilometers away. It hailed the great leader, a term that had up until that point been exclusively used to describe Kim Il-sung. His son, Kim Jong-il, was referred to as Dear Leader. At 8 p.m., speakers at the DMZ announced that Kim Il-sung had passed away due to a bullet wound, and Kim Jong-il had taken over. The flag was lowered to half-mast. The news was a complete shock to the South Koreans and the rest of the world. Kim Jong-il had been the designated successor for a while at this point, and had recently been getting more responsibility within the government. But nobody knew for sure how relations would change under his control. There was also the fact that this hadn't been some peaceful event. If the sources were to be believed, someone had taken the senior Kim's life, and it was possible that this could have contributed to more violence. But there was silence coming from Pyongyang and the North Korean government. The DMZ was the only place where this information was being disseminated. It came from dozens of posts along the DMZ in a coordinated pattern, but from nowhere else. Somehow, things only got more confusing the next day. There were reports that the North Korean embassy in China had closed its doors, while the embassies in China and India tried to tell the world that nothing was happening, and that Kim Il-sung was still alive. Planes going into North Korea had completely halted, with only one Soviet plane landing in the country between November 16th and November 19th. A businessman who traded with North Korea revealed that since November 10th, there had been no mention of Kim Il-sung in the state media, and a co-workers meeting with Kim Jong-il had been postponed. There was also a report that at a Chinese university, all the North Korean students had simultaneously taken off their Kim Sung-il badges. These badges were mandated to be worn wherever a North Korean citizen was out of the house. there was definitely something going on. Most confusing were the messages broadcast at the DMZ. Twice in the early hours of the morning, messages about how great Kim Jong-il was were broadcast. Then at 6 a.m., it was announced that the Vice Marshal, Oh Chin-yu, had taken power. At 8:45, a message came denying that Kim Jong-il had passed away. At just after 10, they proclaimed that the big star of our nation has fallen. 2 hours later, they announced that Kim Il-sung had resigned. By 1 p.m., houses on the North Korean side of the DMZ were displaying black clothing outside their houses as a sign of mourning. Then, on November 18th, Kim Il-sung was photographed at the airport as he greeted the Mongolian politicians. He was alive and well and hadn't resigned or given up power. Things immediately returned to normal. North Korea was apparently pretending that the last few days of confusing messages hadn't happened. They claimed that any rumors of their great leader's passing were South Korean lies. The students at the Chinese university put their Kim badges back on and never spoke about the strange event. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened in North Korea between November 16th and November 18th. All the messages about Kim's demise had come from the DMZ, but the stories of the businessman and the students showed that there was more going on than just some soldiers at the DMZ broadcasting the wrong thing. It was also clear that these rumors hadn't originated from South Korea. The truth to this strange mystery might be one we never learn, or at least not while the Kim family remains in power. When archaeologists announced that they had discovered a Philistine graveyard in 2017, news reports stated that they hoped this would help them to finally solve the ancient mystery of where these people had come from. 2 years later, DNA tests may have answered that mystery. Today, the Philistines are most well known for the role they play in the Bible. Old Testament villains such as the giant Goliath were Philistines. The people primarily lived in 5 city-states in southwestern Levant on the coast. But even in the Bible, their origin isn't exactly clear. The Bible makes it clear they were from somewhere else, though, and weren't living in Canaan when the Israelites arrived. Generally, it's believed the Bible implied that they came from the land of Kaftar, modern-day Crete. But another interpretation is that they descended from a group that lived in the West Nile Delta region. Even if there had been a precise origin included in the Bible, that might not have helped scholars too much, as the text was written many centuries after the Philistines arrived, and by a group that generally considered the Philistines to be their enemies. Looking at the archaeological evidence didn't help much either for a very long time. Philistine settlements were distinguishable from those of their Israelite neighbors in a few ways. The pottery style was noticeably different and more closely resembled pottery that had been found around the Aegean Sea. They also ate pork and used an Aegean script. These markers appeared in the areas occupied by the Philistines around 1200 BC in the late Bronze Age collapse. This was presumably when the Philistines first arrived in the area. Even then, scholars couldn't be certain that was the case. One suggestion was that the artifacts from Greek areas just indicated a higher level of trade with these people during this time period, which could have influenced a change in culture as the local people changed their practices to be more like their new trading partners. There was no way to say for sure these were a new group of people, and not just people who had always lived in the area but had changed their culture. They could have admired their Greek trading partners and sought to mimic them, as the ancient Britons mimicked Romans. One of the major causes for this mystery was the fact that no Philistine cemeteries had been found. Many of their cities had been located and excavated, but large burial sites remained hidden. At one point, archaeologists joked that they may have been buried in the sea like Vikings. That explanation would have leaned into another theory about the origin of the Philistines. The origins of the Sea People is one of the biggest historical mysteries and one of the most famous. During the Bronze Age collapse, this mysterious group raided many Bronze Age settlements that had flourished for centuries. The Egyptian pharaoh wrote about conquering the people, but it's not clear if he actually managed to do so. He definitely didn't without suffering significant losses, and other civilizations around the Eastern Mediterranean didn't fare any better. According to the ancient Egyptians, these people were made up of several different tribes, including a group called the Peliset. Given the similarities between the names, It's been suggested that they may have been the same people. The Philistines did apparently appear around the same time as these attacks were taking place. This group might have settled in the southern Levant area after being defeated in Egypt, and this may even be why later writers may have associated them with the West Nile Delta. But even if the Philistines were the sea people, that still didn't answer the question of where they came from. The origin of the sea people is as much of a mystery as the origins of the Philistines were. In 2017, a discovery was made which could have answered the question for good. A few years earlier, a retired employee of the Israel Antiquities Authority told archaeologists that in the 1980s, he had stumbled across a grave site north of the walls surrounding the Philistine city of Ashkelon. It was promising, and work began on relocating this site to see if there was anything useful. After months of excavation, archaeologists finally found what they were looking for: human remains. These date all the way back to the Iron Age, a few hundred years after the Philistines first arrived in Levant. Not only were their lives different from that of their neighbors, their burial practices were too. There were no secondary burials, as happened elsewhere in Levant, and very few grave goods. More than 200 graves were located at this site, and archaeologists hoped that this could tell them something about the people who had lived there thousands of years ago. DNA samples were taken from the remains of 10 individuals. 3 of these passed away between 1650 and 1200 BC before the Philistines appeared. 4 passed away in the late 1100s, shortly after the Philistines appeared. The final 3 passed away roughly 200 years later. Various DNA markers could tell researchers about where the people's ancestors had come from and where they themselves had lived. The DNA signatures for all 10 individuals showed the majority of their ancestry was from the local Levant gene pool. However, there was a significant difference in the level of European ancestry in the 3 groups. Those who passed away before the arrival of the Philistines had very little European ancestry, between 2 and 9%, while the 4 individuals who were buried in the 1100s had roughly 14% European ancestry. This ancestry came from southern Europe, with Greece, Crete, and Sardinia the most likely origin. This seemed to fit in with the Aegean pottery and script that was found in the archaeological record. It wasn't just a local group copying the culture of another population. This fits less with the theory that these were the notorious Sea People, as the Sea People also attacked Greece and Crete, leading to the destruction of the civilizations that had thrived in those areas. It would be much more likely that the Philistines were a group of people fleeing the Sea People. What was most interesting to researchers was the fact that in the samples taken from the final group, most of that European DNA had disappeared. It was back to roughly the same levels as it was before 1200 BC. This indicated that the Philistines had intermarried with the local population relatively quickly. This would only have been 6 or 7 generations after the arrival of these new people. But there wasn't really any indication that they'd come from anywhere else when looking at their DNA. But culturally, they remained distinct. They were acknowledged as different and other by the local people. They kept their own practices of not following Jewish traditions and using more Greek-style pottery. But even though they would later become villains, they were also able to intermarry with the local population. One expert compared the phenomenon as being similar to how Irish Americans continue to celebrate their heritage while not necessarily being genetically distinct. Scholars warned against drawing too many conclusions from the findings, as it's possible that further DNA testing could reveal more surprising answers to this ancient mystery. The Sun Temples of ancient Egypt is a mysterious phenomenon that has puzzled archaeologists for hundreds of years. It's known who built them, and archaeologists have a pretty good idea of why, but only 2 of the 6 temples have ever been uncovered. Finally, in 2021, archaeologists announced a 3rd lost sun temple had been uncovered, which will hopefully answer more questions about the mysterious temples. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were the gods' representatives on Earth. Their power was granted to them by the gods, in particular the sun god of Ra. But it wasn't until after they passed away that the pharaoh himself would be deified and become a god. Their passing was the beginning of a new journey, which began with the famous pyramids that would start them on the right path in the afterlife. The pyramids also served as places of worship for the new gods. But for a brief period of time, the pharaohs experimented with being deified while still alive. The 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt's Old Kingdom ruled between the 25th and 24th centuries BC. They were the dynasty that ruled directly after those who built the famous pyramids at Giza. But they also built pyramids of their own. The 9 pharaohs that made up the dynasty ruled collectively for about 150 years. Later rulers claimed that the first 3 rulers of this dynasty were actually triplets and the sons of the sun god Ra, destined to overthrow the 4th dynasty. Archaeological evidence shows that the first 3 rulers actually had a father-son relationship, but their dedication to Ra was based on reality. Starting with the first ruler, Usarkaf, the pharaohs built sun temples during their reigns. They were designed to deify the pharaoh while he was still alive. It was a place of worship for the pharaoh as well as Ra. Unlike other temples that had been built previously, there was no burial associated with it, and no mortuary complex was built around it. It was isolated and designed to separate the worship of the sun with the association of the past pharaohs. His successors continued with this tradition, each building their own sun temple. Some are believed to have converted other temples into sun temples, while others built theirs from scratch. A total of 6 have been identified as existing through hieroglyphics and other documents. 1, the Temple of Neferkare, remained in use until at least the reign of Pepi I, who was the 3rd ruler of the 6th dynasty, but only 2 of these have ever been discovered. The first temple to be discovered was actually the Temple of Nusir, the 6th member of the dynasty. It was located in 1898 by a German archaeologist, but it wasn't until later that the significance of the find was realized. This is the most completed sun temple found to date. It was built from limestone blocks and had an altar, a large open courtyard, and several rooms. A few years later, the ruins of the temple of Usarkaf were uncovered. This was much more damaged, and the excavation of the temple initially didn't do a good job of preserving what was left. But today, the 2 temples stand as examples of a unique time for the ancient Egyptian religion. While these 2 temples were found in quick succession, there wouldn't be another one found for over 100 years. A team of archaeologists and Egyptologists dedicated their time to uncovering the 4 lost sun temples. All 4 of them had been written about, but most only had small pieces of information, simply stating that the pharaoh had built or taken over a new temple. It didn't give much of an indication of where to look. The focus began with the Temple of Nusir. When it was first uncovered, archaeologists found mud bricks at the bottom of the temple. It was assumed that this was an earlier building phase, and not much attention was paid to them. Now, the more modern archaeologists were looking closer at them. They found that there were signs of a large entranceway in the mud brick layer, which didn't seem to be part of the stone temple. They also found a layer of debris which included the 2-foot base of a limestone pillar, beer jars filled with mud which was believed to have been part of a religious ritual, as well as seals engraved with the names of kings that came before Nusir. Dating the pottery determined that it had been built in the mid-25th century, a few generations before Nusir ruled. In 2022, archaeologists were able to announce that they believed this was one of the lost sun temples. They believed it had been destroyed by Nusir so he could build his own temple. The size and design of the temple, as well as its location away from everything else, seemed to indicate that this wasn't another ordinary temple, like the ones that may have been taken over by other pharaohs. Who built this temple is a bit of a mystery. One of the seals found in the debris layer had the name of Pharaoh Shepsesker. This king is one that archaeologists don't know a lot about. He's believed to have reigned for only a few months and was either the 4th or 5th ruler of the dynasty. Most archaeologists believe the latter, which would have made him Nusir's direct predecessor. How he fit into the dynasty is unclear, but he may have been a brother, uncle, or nephew of Nusir. If that's the case, destroying his temple might not have simply been because Nusir wanted that location, but as a deliberate act to secure his own position on the throne. Archaeologists hope that further work at the newly found Sun Temple can help to reveal more about this pharaoh and other elements of life during the 5th dynasty of Egypt. The use of mud bricks also helps to explain why other temples haven't been found yet. Mud bricks were typically used when a pharaoh wanted to make something quickly, which would make sense if the temple was built by Shepseskare, as he was only ruler for a few months. But unfortunately, mud bricks are perishable and don't stand the test of time in the same way that stone temples do. Buildings made from mud bricks are also easily demolished. If other temples were made from the same material, it might be that there's nothing left to find. In that case, Nusir's destruction of the temple and building his own on top of it may be the only reason why what's left has been preserved for so long. For thousands of years, archaeologists have been puzzling over a mysterious city that appeared in some ancient Roman documents. The city seemed to be an important trade hub, but was hardly ever mentioned in any of the ancient texts. Even stranger, no trace of the city had been found until 2017. The city was named Neapolis, meaning New City in Greek. It was founded by the Greeks in the 5th century BC, and was later taken over by the Romans when they conquered North Africa. Texts from ancient Rome indicated that it was an important trade hub. It sat on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, with access to the entire Mediterranean Sea. There was an industry there that allowed the people to thrive, but for some reason it wasn't written about much compared to other similar cities. Historians believed that the city had sided with Carthage during the Third Punic War between 149 and 146 BC, which meant the ruling elite there would likely have fallen out of favor with the Roman victors. It doesn't seem as if the city was treated too harshly by the Romans. The city of Carthage was completely destroyed, but those who supported it were allowed to continue, only now under Roman rule. So while the city still existed, there was little mention of it in any records. It may have sided with Julius Caesar during his war with Pompey, which would have put it in a better position, but it still wasn't written about much by the Romans. Then, in 365 CE, all mention of the city disappeared entirely. During July of that year, an earthquake rocked the Mediterranean Sea. It had started in Crete, where one side of the island was lifted 10 meters higher. It then triggered a tsunami, which devastated many coastal areas in the region. Alexandria in Egypt was badly hit, and the anniversary of the devastation was marked until the 6th century. With Neapolis on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, it was assumed that it was also badly impacted by the tsunami. Unlike Alexandria, it apparently didn't recover and became lost to history. In recent years, historians began to get interested in this mysterious city that had apparently vanished from the face of the earth. Even if it was destroyed in the tsunami, it was assumed that there would have been some trace of it found. Unfortunately, the exact location of the city was never disclosed, which meant researchers had the entire north coast of Africa to search. The city of Nabail in Tunisia was one location that needed to be investigated. The city had existed since ancient times and had once been part of the Roman Empire. It's directly on the coast of Tunisia, and today its main economy is tourism. A few ancient Roman ruins gather a lot of attention. Today, these are limited to just a single villa and the residence of a garum factory. Garum is a type of sauce made from fish that was popular in ancient Rome and Greece. It was also the main product made in ancient Neapolis. This could have been a sign for researchers that Nabail was Neapolis, but that wouldn't necessarily have been a good thing. If the modern city was built over the top of the ancient one, it was likely that the ancient Neapolis was completely destroyed, and there would be little researchers could learn from what remained. But a storm in 2013 gave researchers hope. Heavy winds hit the South Mediterranean, shifting sands that had laid on the seabed for hundreds of years. When the weather cleared, unnaturally straight rocks were visible on the seafloor. Researchers were sent to investigate the shapes, and it was clear that it wasn't something that was made by nature. Over time, the investigation uncovered Roman columns, foundations, street signs, and monuments. In 2017, enough evidence had been found to confirm this was the ancient lost city of Neapolis. Of particular interest was the 100 tanks located on the bottom of the seafloor. It's believed these tanks would have been used in the fermentation process of garum. The size of the production process indicated that the city wasn't just a major producer of the sauce, but it may have been the main producer of something that was popular across Rome and Greece. Despite there not being much written about it, it was definitely an important city in the Roman Empire. Researchers next used drones to survey the scene from above. From there, it was possible to determine that the straight lines that they'd seen at the bottom of the sea floor continued onto land. Only part of the ancient city had been lost beneath the waves, with the rest lost beneath the more modern city. The discovery solved an ancient mystery, and one that archaeologists have been working on for 2 decades. But there was more to this discovery. Researchers hope that finding Neapolis will lead investigators to find the answers to other mysteries. They may one day be able to explain more about the history of this ancient city. Even today, Nabail is an important cultural hub, and the ancient city would have changed hands through many different civilizations. It witnessed the Punic Wars and the rise of Rome as an empire. Any records that might have been preserved beneath the waves could provide a unique perspective on an interesting time. We could also learn more about what life was like for the people of Neapolis, and if there's any more reason why not much was written about the city, even with the trade that we know that took place there. For more than 20 years, a Cold War mystery remained unsolved, and the families of 36 fishermen were left questioning what really happened to them. All hopes that this story could have had a happy ending came to an end in 1997, when the FV Gaul was located, and there were still more questions that needed to be answered. FV Gaul was a large fishing vessel that operated in the Barents Sea, north of Scandinavia and western Russia. It was 66 meters long and designed to spend long periods of time in the stormy northern seas. There was a freezer on board and also a factory deck where the fish would be filleted. It was launched in 1971 and is still considered modern when it went missing a little over 2 years later. On January 22, 1974, the Gaul left its home port of Hull, England, and traveled north. It arrived in the Barents Sea 7 days later and cast its nets to begin fishing. The ship was more than at home in the cold and stormy conditions and sent radio messages back home and to other fishing vessels to check in and let everyone know that they were okay. By February 8th, conditions had gotten much worse. A storm had come in, and many smaller vessels would have been unable to cope with the weather. But at 11 a.m., the Gaul radioed in to say that they were still fine and there was nothing to worry about. This would be the last official communication from the vessel. Over the next 2 days, the Gaul missed appointments where it was supposed to check in with the staff in Hull. Nobody was able to reach the ship, and by February 10th, people were beginning to get worried. A search for the ship was launched. It began with a UK Navy ship that was in the area, but soon included more ships from both the UK and Norway, as well as planes and specially trained Norwegian search and rescue teams. According to the official inquiry, an area of 177,000 square miles was thoroughly searched by sea and air. But at 4 p.m. on February 15th, the search was officially ended. At that time, no trace of the ship had been found. There was no debris, no lifeboats, and not even an oil slick left on the surface. For many, especially the families of those involved in the disappearance, the search had been called off far too soon. It seemed impossible that a storm had managed to sink the Gaul. The storm that had hit the Barents Sea that weekend had been particularly ferocious. It reached a 10 on the Beaufort scale, which measures wind and wind force. At sea, this can cause waves of up to 40 feet in height, and on land, it's powerful enough to uproot trees. For most people, this wasn't the type of weather that they'd want to be out at sea in, but the crew of the Gaul were all experienced sailors. The captain, Peter Nellist, had never captained the Gaul before, but he had captained vessels of a similar size, and would have been more than capable of dealing with the storm. On top of that, no distress signal had been sent, which made people believe that the ship must have sunk quickly. Many people suspected something more sinister had happened. The fact that UK officials were reluctant to search for the wreck only seemed to boost that theory. The official explanation was that there were many wrecks from the Second World War in the area, and it would cost a lot of money to determine which of the sunken ships was the Gaul. A few months after the official search ended, a life buoy from the vessel was discovered by a Norwegian team. Other fishing vessels in the area reported their nets snagging on an underwater obstacle that hadn't been there before, but there was no effort to try to find out what that was. Many suspected that the ship hadn't been found because it had been doing something it shouldn't have. This was the height of the Cold War, and the Barents Sea was an important area for both the West and the Soviet Union. It was here where underwater microphones were placed to try to track Soviet submarines. There were also submarines from both sides of the Iron Curtain operating in the area. There were two main theories about what had happened. The first was that there were Navy personnel on the ship, or it was otherwise being used to spy on the USSR. For decades, the authorities denied that any fishing vessels were being used this way. They would admit that there were sometimes Navy personnel on ships, but claimed that it was just so they could get some experience at sea. It would later come out that this wasn't the case, and conspiracy theories had been true. Fishermen were given cameras and asked to take photographs of any Russian vessels they saw. The Navy personnel were there for espionage purposes. But even when this news emerged, the authorities insisted that the Gaul hadn't been used in this way. The theory suggested that either this wasn't true, or the Soviets simply suspected that the crew were spies, and either sunk the ship or arrested them. This gave the families of the sailors hope that their loved ones may still be alive somewhere in a Soviet prison. The other theory was that the ship's nets had snagged a submarine in the area, or an underwater microphone, and had been dragged underwater. This had happened elsewhere, but those fishing vessels were much smaller than the Gaul. The mystery remained until 1997, when a Channel 4 television documentary crew set out to find the wreck of the Gaul. It was located near to where other fishing vessels had noticed the new underwater obstacle. The ship was found intact, indicating that it hadn't been destroyed by some kind of enemy fire. There was a large gash on the ship, just above the waterline, and initially there were reports that this had been caused by some kind of collision with another vessel, but this was eventually ruled out. Explorations of the ship located human remains, and DNA testing confirmed they belonged to 3 of the sailors that had been on the Gaul when it disappeared. But only 3 people were ever identified, and some believe that the others may have washed ashore or otherwise escaped. Human remains found on a beach in Norway were tested but confirmed to not belong to the sailors, and it was officially concluded that they had all gone down with the ship. The final mystery was what had caused the ship to sink. Its sister vessels hadn't sunk in similar stormy conditions, so there were a lot of questions about why this ship hadn't survived. When submersibles took video footage of the underwater wreckage, they found the answer. The Gaul had multiple hatches around the ship. There was one where the fish would be dropped into the lower decks. This was found fastened down, as would be expected, but there were other hatches leading to chutes from the factory deck. These were used during the filleting process to dispose of the waste products from the fish. These hadn't been fastened down. It's believed that the captain, who wasn't used to being on a ship with a factory deck, hadn't remembered to close these hatches during the storm. Water flooded in from these chutes, and when the ship tried to turn to face the waves, it capsized as the water moved to one side. The sinking would have been very fast, explaining why a distress signal was never even set. What made the 2021 announcement that archaeologists had located the tomb of Emperor Wen of Han so surprising was the fact that for thousands of years, nobody had known the tomb was missing. This mystery was believed to have been solved in antiquity, letting the truth remain hidden until a strange series of events led to it being found. Emperor Wen of Han was the 5th emperor of the Han dynasty. He ruled between 180 and 157 BC, and his reign was the beginning of a golden era continued by his son. Wen was known for being frugal, following Confucianism, and was generally liked by his people. Later stories involved him caring for his sick mother and testing all the food and medicine she was given himself so that she couldn't be poisoned. When he passed away in 157, the exact location of his tomb was never written. However, there were some hints as to the location. One book of records written many generations later stated that the mountains and the rivers had not been changed to create Wen's tomb. The Book of Han said that because the mountain was hidden, there would be no raised graves. Earlier emperors had created mounds over their tombs. Called Chinese pyramids, these were made of compacted earth and clearly displayed where the tomb of the emperor was. As the landscape had been unchanged by Wen's tomb, It was clear to later historians that they weren't looking for a mound over the grave, or at least not a man-made one. It was theorized that the emperor's tomb had been built out of an existing mountain. Ancient Chinese scholars eventually came to the conclusion that a mountain named Feng Huangzhu was the site of the great emperor's tomb. Evidence for this came from a time when a river flooded and washed down stone blocks from the mountain that were believed to have come from a tomb inside. It was also relatively close to the tomb of the Empress Do, Wen's wife. This tomb was located just 2,400 meters southeast of the mountain. No excavations could take place, as this was considered to be disrespectful, but there seemed to be enough evidence that this was the hidden place in the mountains that Han historians had written about. Monuments were placed by later emperors to mark the significance of this site. In more recent times, archaeologists and historians wanted to learn more about Wen of Han and his tomb. This was the first time a Chinese emperor had his tomb cut out of the mountain, and it was a style that was later mimicked by his successors. Excavating the tomb directly was still off limits, but researchers could still look around the site without excavating anything, and what they found was confusing. There were no signs that there had been any kind of building work on the mountain. There were no excavated rocks or anything of that kind, or objects such as pottery from the Han Dynasty period. Even the soil type used in the Han Dynasty tombs wasn't found. It was disappointing, but it was assumed that this just meant that the tomb was very well hidden. Historians next hoped that technology might be able to provide some insights into the tomb. Technology had made it possible to look into other tombs, such as the famous tomb of China's first emperor, and there was no reason to believe it wouldn't be useful here. Unfortunately, the technology seemed to indicate this was an ordinary mountain. There had been no excavations, and nobody had been buried there. Meanwhile, 2,100 meters south, archaeologists were working on another site. Since the 1960s, it was known that there was something unusual about an area near the Ba River. Pebbles from the river seemed to be outlining something, but farmers had also used the area to sow crops, and it had largely been neglected. There had been some investigations over the years, but it wasn't until 2006 that it became more interesting to archaeologists. In 2002, 6 terracotta figures were listed in an auction catalog in the US. Chinese officials recognized them as being relics from the Western Han Dynasty and not something that had been given away. After some work by diplomats, the relics were brought back to China, and eventually, the people who had taken them were traced. They confessed that they'd gotten the relics from the area that was now called the Zhenkun Grave. It seemed there was more importance to this area than it had at first seemed. A survey at the site showed a large tomb complex. This was just 800 meters from the site of Empress Do's tomb. The Empress's tomb was actually part of this new complex. Still, the investigation didn't go far. It wasn't until the graves were robbed again in 2016 that conservation efforts took place. As part of that, the site was explored by scholars, and the true extent of what had been found was uncovered. There were over 100 burial pits surrounding the central tomb. More of the terracotta figures were found, as well as pottery, official seals, and parts of chariots. The complex had been built to represent different areas of the government, with a grand tomb at its center. Symbolically, the person at the center of the complex was at the center of the Chinese government and the country as a whole. As well as the central tomb, there was the tomb of Empress Do and another for Empress Bo, Wen's mother. There were also the remains of many different animals, and these included a giant panda. This was the first time archaeologists had discovered the remains of an entire panda in a burial complex, though the skull of a panda had been found in the tomb of Empress Bo. The panda's head was pointed east towards the central tomb. There was also a tamir, which is believed to have already gone extinct in China by the time Emperor Wen ruled. Peacocks, bison, yaks, and reptiles were among the other animals found in various pits. The mammals were buried in brick receptacles, with reptiles in wooden coffins and birds in pottery receptacles. These were all believed to be sacrifices. If the government was represented by the seals and chariots, then this is believed to have been a representation of the extravagant royal gardens, which would have needed a wide range of environments to suit all the animals known to have lived in them. Some of the animals were believed to have been brought to the burial complex as tributes from other parts of the country. It was obvious that whoever was buried in the central tomb was a figure of high importance. As with the mountain tomb, excavation of this central tomb was not permitted. But from all the evidence, it seemed clear that there was only one person who could have been buried there. In 2021, historians were about to announce that this was the final resting place of Emperor Wen. No mound had been built on top of his grave, as the ancient historians had said. Instead, from above ground, the gravesite seemed to be a symbol of the frugal nature he was known for. But with the wealth of artifacts that have so far been discovered during excavations, it's clear that whoever arranged the burial wanted there to be some kind of symbol of his importance and power. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.